Hi, Nick Rains here from Leica Academy Australia. In this video I'm going to go through my settings on the Leica M10-P. These are the settings that I use most of the time, the way I have the camera set up. It's not a deep dive into all the menu options, it's just the way I personally prefer to actually use the camera. So let's have a look at these menus. Let's turn the camera on and go into the menus here, and the first thing you're going to see is the favorites. Now these are things you can actually choose yourself to appear in this list, and you do that later in the customized controls. So these are things that you would access more frequently, and it gives you a shortcut to them. But I'm going to go through the main menu itself, which is down there, and it starts off with lens detection, and this is so that the camera can recognize the lens that's being used. And if I just open this up, you should be able to see here these little white and black spots. This is your 6-bit encoding of these lenses. So the next one is drive mode, and I tend to shoot in single shot most of the time, one press, one picture. You can shoot burst mode, but there's also the option for exposure bracketing, and I can choose the number of shots, and I can choose the exposure difference between those shots. So this is 3 shots at plus and minus 2, and that is displayed down here in the 3 little red lines, 2 stops apart. So I get 2 stops under a normal exposure and 2 stops over, which gives me a nice exposure bracket. You can also set your self timer here, either at 12 seconds or 2 seconds. When I'm on tripod, I often use the 2-second self timer, mostly because I'm a little bit lazy and I don't have a cable release to plug into here, so why not use the self timer. Next option, exposure metering. I always use multi-field for all of my cameras. It just seems to get me closer to the correct exposure that much quicker. Exposure compensation is off at the moment because it hasn't been set. We'll be using this dial here to actually set that, and I'll come back to that a little bit later on. I'm not using a flash on this camera, so we'll move past that. ISO setup is important. Maximum auto ISO. So when I have the camera set into auto ISO here, then I can choose the maximum that it will go up to. I can also choose the lowest shutter speed that the camera will use. Right now it's set to 125th. The way this works is that as the light levels drop and you're in aperture priority automatic here, the shutter speed will drop as the light drops, but it will hit a floor of 125th, at which time the ISO will go up to compensate. Now you can change the shutter speed at which the shutter speed stops falling and the ISO increases. This is basically to stop camera shake. So if you set it to a 60th, the shutter speed will never drop below a 60th. Or you can set it to a function of the focal length of the lens that's fitted. And this is actually a really good way to work. If I set it to 1/2f, the shutter speed will never drop below a number which is double the focal length of the lens. Now this is a 50mm Summilux lens, so that means if I set this to 1/2f, the shutter speed will bottom out at 100th of a second. It won't go any lower than that. If I had a 90mm lens on here, that would be 180th of a second. If I had a 24mm lens, it would be a 50th of a second or thereabouts. It's a very, very useful way to work. It means that you are minimizing the chances of getting unexpected camera shake. Next item, white balance. I only shoot raw, as you can see from D&G here, so the white balance has very little effect on raw files. In fact, it has a 0 effect. So I just leave that on daylight by habit. I'm shooting raw. I can shoot raw plus JPEG. I tend to shoot raw. Next one, JPEG settings. I don't have any need to change those because I'm not shooting JPEGs. Auto review I always turn off because I don't want the camera to produce an image immediately after I've shot it. I want to shoot the next picture, and if you're using the electronic viewfinder, the visor flex, you really don't want that image to pop up in front of your eye and block you from taking the next picture, so turn that off. Capture assistance. Focus peaking. When you are using the live view on the back here or the electronic viewfinder, you'll see there's a red haze around the picture where the focus point is, and as you focus the camera you'll see that haze move around. That's showing you where your most contrasty part of the picture is, which of course is where the actual focus point is. Histogram I have turned on. Again, it shows up in the live view on the back and in the viewfinder here, the electronic viewfinder. Leave that on. Exposure clipping I change to 0 and 254. And the reason I do that is because I don't care about the lower limit. This is not important. It's only relevant for JPEGs, not RAW files. RAW files have much more shutter information, so that's not helpful. But the upper limit means that when a pixel goes beyond 254, it will flash in the viewfinder. So an overexposed highlight will be flashing in my visor flex or on the back of the camera, and this is how I judge exposure. If nothing is flashing, then nothing is overexposed. So if you've got a hot spot on someone's face that's flashing, you'll know that that hot spot is overexposed and you'll have no information there at all. So that's a really nice way to work. But change those to 0 and 254, that will help immensely. Grids, you can have grids turned on or off, very useful. Exposure simulation is worth a few comments. I have that on permanent, so when I'm again looking through the viewfinder or using live view, I will see a continuously updating representation of my exposure. So if I'm underexposed, it'll look dark. If I'm overexposed, it'll look light. If I turn that off, it will always look the same regardless of the exposure until you half press the shutter button. Because if I go into the options, you can see, what's it say, release half pressed, okay, or permanent. Leave it on permanent and you'll always see a reasonably close idea of what the picture is going to look like. Focus aid automatic, that means that as soon as I move the focusing ring here, it will magnify my live view mode either in the visor flex or on the back of the camera. Now none of that works of course with the rangefinder, because this is not an electronic viewfinder, this is optical. So these things have very little effect on how you use the camera with the rangefinder. They only really work with the live view on the back of the camera or the electronic viewfinder when you add it to the top of the camera. Level gauge are very useful. I like to have my pictures level if possible, so turn that on. Again, visible on the back and on the visor flex, but not in the actual rangefinder viewfinder. The next one would be EVF display control. Those are fairly self-explanatory. User profiles means that you can save your camera settings for when you add new firmware, or whether you, if you have to reset the camera for some reason, you can save all these settings and load them in later. Very useful. Customized control, there's a couple of things worth mentioning here. Here's those favorites I was talking about. So if you go into this, you can turn on and off any of the menu items and they will appear in that first list when you first press the menu. That's how you change them, and you can make the camera work the way you want to work here. Customize wheel, exposure compensation, or live view zoom or off. Now live view zoom would mean that when you dial the dial it magnifies, but because you've got it automatically magnifying when you actually move the focusing ring, there's no real point. So leave that on exposure compensation, and that means that you have direct access to exposure compensation. When you're in aperture priority, you can dial in exposure comp without having to press any other buttons. It basically makes it a dedicated wheel for exposure comp. Display brightness, leave those on auto. Auto power saving, I have that set to 2 minutes. Your mileage may vary, whatever you think appropriate. Date and time setting, fairly obvious. Language, reset camera. Image numbering you can change if you want to, the way it develops the or produces file names. I change my file names anyway later in Lightroom, so I don't need to worry about that. Sensor cleaning is worth mentioning. If you look inside the camera here, you'll see the shutter. So the sensor is hidden. You need to open that shutter so you can get a swab in to clean the sensor. So you trigger it here, open shutter, clean the sensor, and then you turn the camera off to close the shutter again. So be careful with that, very important. Camera information is for firmware updates. So look, it's a pretty simple camera. That's the whole point of this camera. There's nothing more than you need and nothing less than you need. Das Wesentliche, the essential. It's a beautiful little bit of camera. I use it occasionally for fun. I don't use it for work so much. This is an indulgence for me, but it's a beautiful piece of equipment and produces images of the highest quality, of course. But like all cameras, you should really have it set to work for you, rather than having to fumble around with the menu items all the time. So spend a little bit of time setting the camera up for your way of working, and you'll find that you have a much higher hit rate of images.